Welcome to Jewish Life, a program presented in cooperation with the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York. I'm your host, Stewart Ain. Each week, we present programs of particular interest to the Jewish community, and we are recording this program in February 2026. It's the 250th anniversary of the United States, and I could think of no one better to talk about this than Robert Watson. He is a historian, author, professor, news analyst, community leader. He's a professor at Lynn University in Florida. And welcome to the program. I could go on. Your credits are, but I think you're well known to most of our audience here. So I want to thank
Well,
you very much for joining us.
thank you, Stuart. It's a pleasure to join you, but also thank you for what you do in educating the public through these programs.
Thank you. Thank you. So 250 years. And I wanted to talk about people like Chaim Solomon. I think everybody knows Chaim Solomon, right? They called him the financier of the war. Can you talk a little bit about him? And he, what struck me, he put so much money in that when he
Hmm.
died, he was penniless. And
It's
so I
true,
wanted to find out, what did that mean,
true.
penniless? So
Well,
I checked. Yeah,
go ahead.
I checked. He put in the government owed him $350,000. Works out to 11,695,123.71.
Don't forget that 71 cents. Yeah, it's an extraordinary amount of money. And the story is both inspiring and tragic. So as we celebrate the 250th, I have a book called Declaration that was just released a couple days ago. And I also helped to research and put together a TV documentary, a 90-minute movie on this called the Independence Dawn, for
Mhm.
the Forgotten Revolution, and that'll air in a couple of months. And both of
Oh, we're on
these,
PBS.
we're not. I'm not sure yet. That's
Okay,
handled by the distributor, the director,
sure,
producer. Uh, Probably everywhere, probably PBS.
sure.
uh, Both the movie and the book focus on the little known stories. We all know about George Washington. We know that Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration. It's not as well known that Ben Franklin edited it quite heavily. But we need to remember Native peoples were involved in all this. The American Indians, if the British won, they were in trouble. If the Americans won, they were really in trouble. So they were damned if they did, damned if they didn't. Which side did they pick? As Jefferson is writing that all men are created equal, and we have this aspirational promise of liberty and equality, women, indentured servants, enslaved folks, no one could own land or had the basic voting rights. So we need to remember all the voices, including Jewish voices, and there is none more exciting and important than Haim Solomon. So Haim Solomon's personal story is interesting. His family were, like so many Jews throughout history, were basically refugees. They were in what is present-day Poland at one point, and there were sort of vigilante raids on the community. These ruffian gangs of hateful people would attack the community. Haim Solomon, as a young man, is actually organizing the resistance to some of this. So he's a remarkable person. He ends up pretty much having to flee. He travels across Europe where he picks up, financial skills. He becomes, understanding of international cultures, and a remarkable person. Ultimately, he goes to England where he learns about the Revolutionary War. And Solomon, being an advocate for justice, he wants to join the American side. So he sails. He arrives here and he marries into one of the wealthiest families in the entire American colonies. They're shippers, traders, merchants, as many Jewish families were. The family, however, are loyalists, royalists. That is, they're pro-crown. So like so many, and we don't know how many people left the country. We don't have, historians don't have accurate numbers on it, but so many people were loyalists or royalists who fled the country. Many went to the West Indies. They would go to Barbados or Jamaica or some British controlled island, or they went to Nova Scotia or Halifax, figuring that the Revolutionary War would last a couple of days, couple of weeks, couple of months at the most, and then they'd come back. Many lose everything. Many never come back. At any rate, the family left. Haym Salomon stays, takes over their business, so he has at his fingertips the resources of a very successful shipping trading company. He marries the daughter of this family, so he's established financially. What he does, which is remarkable, the American cause, the revolution, is lacking for money. Thanks to Ben Franklin and John Adams and other diplomats, we get financial support from the Dutch, from the French, from the Spanish, and France also sends ships, powder, muskets, something new called a bayonet. So they provide all this support. Solomon plays a major role in being a liaison between Ben Franklin's efforts, these other allies, and the country. In fact, we have an 18th century, it survived history, the equivalent of a check, and it's sent by the French government to support the revolution. It's not made out to Washington, Continental Congress, or Jefferson. It's made out to Haym Salomon, which is just unimaginable that they did it. And thank goodness it survived history. So Haym Salomon, he's trading, shipping, he's loaning money to the cause. He's using his connections and knowledge of international trade, all to support the revolution. He does something more. When the founders gather in Philadelphia for the various meetings of the Continental Congress and so on, Solomon has properties there. He allows some of them to stay at his properties. And he develops a friendship with George Washington, but a very important friendship with Alexander Hamilton, a man who's more of a son to Washington than just a colonel or an aide. We'll talk about Hamilton later. His Jewish connections and roots are extraordinary. So what happens is Solomon does all that. When the war ends, there is this awful effort by the early Congress to create something of a religious loyalty test, that you cannot be a full citizen with the full enfranchisement, voting rights, and so on, unless if you're a Christian. So this is so awfully misguided. Solomon, after the war, who has not been paid back, by the way, as you correctly noted, Solomon, who is married and has children, Solomon, who's now struggling, as most people living in America were. Remember, the British have the world's most powerful navy. They blockade the coast. It's hard to ship and trade. People are being captured by the British. Ships are being sunk. Entire coastal communities and economies collapsed. So Solomon's struggling. And he also is dying of, we believe, it was tuberculosis. So Solomon, after the war, in bad health, on his last breath with the family, he goes to the Continental Congress and tries to talk them out of this awful effort that they were doing. They don't listen to him. One of the last things Solomon does is he asks his friend Alexander Hamilton if he would go in and lobby, to use the present parlance, on behalf of him and this cause. Alexander Hamilton gets these founders who all owe Solomon, and he brings them before Congress to stop this misguided effort. But Alexander Hamilton, an astute politician, he brings in Stewart, the heavy artillery, George Washington. And when they walk in, they kill this measure, and Solomon dies shortly thereafter. But it's one of his last great contributions. He also used what was left of his money to create Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, one of the most important synagogues in the entire country. You could make the argument for the most important, given its location, as Philadelphia would serve not only as the city that hosted the Declaration of Independence and the Continental Congress, but later the Constitutional Convention. And while we were building what would become Washington, D.C., hacking it out of the swamps, bogs, and forests, Philadelphia served for 9 years as our interim capital. So right in the heart of it, right near Christ Church, which is where George Washington prayed, Betsy Ross prayed. It's the who's who church. Right near it is Haim Solomon's Mikveh Israel. So his legacy is extraordinary. And I don't know that the revolution goes as it did without a Haim Solomon front and center.
Absolutely, absolutely. You mentioned the synagogue. So the first synagogue in the country is one that was named after a spiritual leader, Isaac Turo, up
Toro.
in Newport. Right.
Yeah,
So
Newport, Rhode Island.
Newport, Rhode Island, right. And but he was a loyalist. So he supported the British. And so when the war started, he sailed with his family to Jamaica and lived out the war under British rule. And so I wondered today
Yeah.
why it's still called Turo
Yeah.
Synagogue. Why would you call it after the?
Yeah. I think there's two clear arguments there. He was a loyalist, a royalist who supported the British and fled, so the name should be changed. On the other hand, he was the spiritual leader. He led his flock. He had the vision to create something. He was a leader not only of the synagogue, but in the community. And that's an extraordinary thing when you think about how small the Jewish community was in that period in time. There were about a half a dozen communities in the American colonies and later the early states that had a Jewish community. No, Newport was one of them. New York City was one. Philadelphia was one. Charleston, South Carolina was one. All these are, coastal proximity because so many of the Jews had arrived as refugees. They were shippers, merchants, traders. They knew other languages. They had connections in Europe that could prove beneficial to both their business and the American colonists. So you have those couple of small communities there. Jews, much like others, were in this precarious situation. Like I said at the outset of this program, think of the difficult decision Native American leaders had to make. Do we stay on the sidelines? Well, we can't because we have skin in the game. Depending on who wins, there we go. And the fact that Americans won, we celebrate it, but from an American Indian perspective, it's the beginning of the end of Native self-determination on the continent. Jews had to make the same decision. How are we going to be treated under Americans? How are we going to be treated under the British? And I think most of them, like Indians and others, felt they would not be treated well under the British, but they'd be treated horribly under these puritanical, violent Americans. And, I go back and I think if I was in that situation as a new Jewish settler or Native American, I perhaps would have supported the British despite my love of the ideals of independence and liberty, but from a purely self-interest perspective. Now, here's the good news. Even though, unfortunately for those folks, they went to Jamaica, Barbados, Halifax, etc., most never came back. They left and they would later go to Britain or stay in the West Indies and really didn't come back, which meant they lost most everything. The good news is this. George Washington was a friend of the Jewish diaspora, no question. Washington writes the famous letter to the Newport congregation, which still survives, and you can read it. And
Yes.
he not only wrote that letter, Stewart, he wrote letters to each one of the Jewish communities, these 5 or 6 communities I mentioned earlier, to their synagogues, to their spiritual leaders, and he assures the small Jewish community that his commitment to political liberty in this new country, this nascent republic, is matched by his commitment to religious liberty. You have a home here. He even refers in some of his letters as the stock of Abraham, he says. So Washington knows his history. He knows a little bit about the persecution. He knows about the promise. He knows how important it is substantively and symbolically that he, the greatest man in the country, the father of this country, reach out and set that tone. Now, the question must be asked, how would George Washington, who was not traveled, not educated, not well-read, how would he know all this and why would he do all this? And the answer is in a name, Hamilton. Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton is born illegitimately in the island of Nevis. Some people say Nevis, which is a 6 by 9 mile small island in the Caribbean, the West Indies. His family is forced to move to St. Croix for a short period of time, flee to St. Kitts. The Hamiltons were on all sides refugees. The Hamiltons were the mother uh, uh, was French, and in France there was this something called the Edict of Nantes, Nantes, which dates back to the late 1500s, 1590s, something like that. The Edict of Nantes was remarkable. It was remarkable. It was one of the first proclamations in world history that provided religious freedom, political rights to all minority groups. In Catholic France, that meant Protestants, Huguenots, Jews, and others. Remarkable document. And for about a century, people lived in relative peace with a relative degree of rights. Remarkable for the time. But then what happens is King Louis overturns it. Historians call it the Revocation of Nantes. And what happens is wholesale persecution takes place. You and I, Stewart, would recognize it as some of the pogroms in Europe in the 1930s. Jews cannot marry non-Jews. People cannot have certain jobs. People are forced to flee. There's a mass exodus out of France. Historians don't know the exact numbers, but one of the families that fled were the Fawcettes, and that would be Hamilton's mother. So they flee. They go to Nevis in the Caribbean. Nevis is kind of a place of refuge.
Mhm.
There are refugees from all over Europe. Well, it turns out that a drunk Scotsman named Hamilton arrives in the island, and he meets Hamilton's mother, Rachel Fawcett, and they have a fling. They never get married. She's accused of being a prostitute. I mean, just a really, it's just shocking. It's like a Kardashian story. And they have two children, James and Alexander. So that's Hamilton. So it's illegitimate.
There you go. Right.
But what happens was Rachel, when she was a teenager, we're not sure of her age. My guess would be 17-ish. When she was a teenager, the family fled from Nevis to St. Croix. She married a Jew. His name was Johann Michael Lavienne. Lavienne from Levi. He was Sephardic. And Lavienne was also a refugee. He had fled persecution in Europe and went to St. Croix. The two of them get married. And then Rachel gets arrested for multiple acts of whoredom. This is where the prostitution comes in. We don't know if she was or she wasn't. Lavienne flees. Rachel goes to prison in Christianstadt, St. Croix, which is the main city. There's a colonial fort there today, and she was a prisoner in the dungeon. She managed to live through this horrible ordeal. She managed to get out of prison. She flees to St. Kitts, then flees back to Nevis, and that's where she shacks up with this drunk Scotsman named James Hamilton. So Hamilton, little Alexander, is illegitimately born. The island is overrun by diseases, yellow fever and malaria. It's overrun by piracy, the horrors of slavery. Hurricanes hit it. It's a horrible upbringing for him. And at one point, his mother contracts a disease and dies. He's now orphaned because the father had run away,
How
the
old is he?
biological father. So Hamilton's around 11. We're not sure of the age, but he's orphaned now. Hamilton is shoeless. He caught the disease himself. We think it might have been yellow fever. We're not sure. Hamilton's homeless, shoeless, starving. However, the generosity of the Jewish community came out for Hamilton. They knew that his mother was married to Lavienne, the Sephardic Jew. They knew that the Hamiltons were persecuted the way they were persecuted. Little Alexander Hamilton was invited to attend the Hebrew school at the one synagogue on the island. And he went to the Hebrew school, and guess what? He can speak Hebrew. He knows the language, he knows the story. Thankfully, from the surviving letters from the adult Hamilton, we know that when his children were little, he taught them to recite the Decalogue in Hebrew. He told them stories of Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, Noah, Moses. So Hamilton had I guess you could say, Jewish roots, even if he wasn't religiously or ethnically or whatever the case might be Jewish. He had Jewish roots, a Jewish circle. So what happens is Hamilton moves to New Jersey, later to New York during the Revolution, meets George Washington, who makes Hamilton a colonel, his aide, and Hamilton basically helps Washington run the war. So if you look at George Washington's actions during and after the war, where he makes it crystal clear that Jews have a home in this country and I am there for you. And he shows a remarkable degree of tenderness and knowledge. Where did that come from? Guess who wrote all
Hamilton.
of his speeches? Hamilton.
Hamilton. That's
Hamilton wrote
great.
his speeches, wrote his letters. So you can imagine Washington sitting at the desk and Hamilton leaning over his shoulder saying, "To the stock of Abraham, you have a." So, uh,
Yes.
so history has a great debt to pay to not only Haym Solomon and George Washington, but Hamilton. And it was Hamilton, the mathematical financial genius, later Secretary of the Treasury, who solved the debt, who was friends with Haym Solomon, a mathematical financial genius. The two of them worked together. Solomon was aware of Hamilton's Jewish roots. Hamilton spoke Hebrew. They had a connection. They worked together. So there's these wonderful overlapping stories here,
Yes.
which
Yes.
I hope that it gets more coverage. Thank you for doing this show. I hope that it gets more coverage as we celebrate the 250th.
Interesting. I saw two different figures for the number of Jews in the 13 colonies. One said 1,500 Jews, another said 2,000. Which
Yeah.
do you think was right?
Yeah, I've seen the saying. The very first census, as we know it, was taken in 1790. Now, imagine how rudimentary it was. This country had very few bridges. We didn't have paved roads. Ports are still being built. You have isolated villages around the country. So we don't really know. So what I do when I write about it, I say somewhere shy of 2,000. Now that's ridiculously small. And it wasn't spread evenly across this vast land. It was in these 5 or 6 little communities that we mentioned earlier, like Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and Newport, was the Jewish
What's
community.
interesting to me was that the British were so cruel to the Jews. There's a story about a man named Reuben Edding from Baltimore. He enlists and gets in battle and he gets arrested and imprisoned by the British. And when they find out that he's Jewish, they will feed him only pork. He refuses to eat it. And so he survives on scraps of food from other prisoners. And by the time he's released, he dies of, of, of hunger, I guess. And but that really,
I mean,
British
that's
did
that's
that.
that's cruel and unusual. It's beyond the pale of punishment or imprisonment. So, among the books I've written, I wrote one book about the British policies toward American prisoners during the Revolutionary War. I wrote
Mhm.
another book about the War of 1812 and the British treatment of people, and I wrote another one about World War II and the Holocaust and the British not doing enough to try to prevent or stop or mitigate the Holocaust. So they come up pretty bad in all three books. And like you just said, I documented some horrible cases that are in the record, in the archives, in the military history reports, in diaries and letters. So it's not a theory, it's there. And we sometimes have this view that the British were sitting around drinking tea with their pinky raised and they could not possibly be capable of such cruelty, but truly they were. For example, in this one book of mine called The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn, the British converted an old, hawking, rotting warship into a floating prison, and they anchored it or they moored it, I should say, technically, they moored it just off the coast of Brooklyn, near where the Navy Yard was. And they filled it with American prisoners. Thousands died in that ship during the war. And you have examples of the British purposely dumping the human excrement overboard and then lowering the buckets to get their water from that same water. So if you didn't drink, you would die. If you did drink, you'd get a disease and you would die. We have examples of the British purposely separating families, of arbitrarily stabbing people, just horrible instances. So what we need to remember is that history is written by blood, and all cultures, all peoples have committed just heinous crimes. War, I always write, brings out the greatest in humanity, but it also brings out the worst. So let's use your example and what I just said and go back to what I said earlier. The Jewish community has a decision to make. Do we go with the British or do we go with the
Yeah.
Americans?
So which way
The
do they go? Most of them.
which way, and they're damned either way. The fact that so many went with the British, despite that treatment, shows the worry and concern about the violence and this puritanical, like an early neo nascent evangelical kind of that they saw this coming in the American people. But fortunately, as I said, Washington, Hamilton, and thanks to the work of Haim Solomon, it wasn't as bad as many anticipated it would be.
It's pointed out that the war, this Revolutionary War, marked the first time since their exile from Jerusalem that the Jews were able to march alongside their Christian neighbors as equals in the fight for freedom, which is when I read that, I said, that's right. It
Yeah.
was yes.
That's a goosebumps moment. In fact, Jews did fight in the Revolutionary War. Jews served in a number of capacities. One of the big challenges during the revolution was logistics. Where do you get uniforms? Where do you get food? Where do you get shoes? Where do you get powder? And there were a lot of shippers, suppliers, traders, merchants who would be, by today's parlance, defense contractors, who were providing this service and weaponry to the army. Now, you might say, well, that's opportunistic, but it wasn't, because the Continental Congress was broke and many suppliers never got paid. So many did it not just for business purposes, but because of a love of liberty and so on. And this goes all the way through. We have this is not something I write about, but we have documented examples of Jews serving in the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 48, the American Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II. Every great conflict, Jewish soldiers have marched lockstep. In fact, one of my heroes, probably my main hero, is Harry Truman. I've always been a big Truman
Sure.
fan. And
Yes.
Harry Truman, after World War II ended in 45, of course, FDR dies on April 12th of 45, Truman's president. Truman wanted to, as he phrased it, right the wrong and do something. It was Truman who would support, of course, statehood for Israel, massive loan guarantees for Israel, joint immigration agreements, joint military cooperation. He would veto anti-Israel measures in the UN. I mean, it's Truman that pretty much set the special bonds of this special relationship all this time. But at the end of the war, Truman wanted to integrate the armed services.
Hmm.
And he was defeated by Southern and conservative interest. He tries it again in 1948, and he's defeated again. That would have to wait until the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But what Truman does in 1948, he passes an executive order. It's a presidential signature, 9981, that integrates the military. And when he does it on behalf of four great groups of heroes during the war. He talks about, one, the Tuskegee Airmen, the Black Flyers, who escorted our bombers over European theaters. Yet when they came home, they couldn't go to a drinking fountain or a school or ride wherever they wanted in a bus. They were persecuted. Secondly, the Navajo code talkers. These Navajo Indians from northeastern Arizona were code talkers because the Japanese and the Germans, but the Japanese were great at cracking our code. So we would have a Navajo on either end of the radio talking in Navajo, which didn't have a written language, only an oral language, and very complicated.
You
Number
got 30
three,
seconds.
okay. Number three was the Japanese Americans who fought with us in the war, and number four, Jewish Americans. So Truman honors that long legacy of all these various groups who fight, win, and yet we needed a double V campaign: victory in Europe, but victory at home for liberty and rights for all these people. So it starts in the Revolution, goes all the way through to Harry Truman, and then even today.
Great. This has been what a great half hour. Thank you, Robert Watson. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Stewart.
Great half hour. Thank you. This has been Jewish Life. My name is Stewart Ain. Until next week, have a good one.